On to the final part of the Socratic method, and then we'll look at Socrates' view of reasoning and definitions, as well as inductive reasoning. So, the method of counterexample. As you might gather from the term counterexample, this involves presenting an example that counters. So when Socrates applied this method, he would present an example that goes against, or counters, the definition he is assessing or criticizing. Now, this is done to show that a definition is too broad or too narrow, or possibly both. So essentially there are two ways a definition in this context can go bad. It can be too broad, which occurs when the definition of the term being presented allows in too much. So things that should not be included in the definition are allowed in by that definition. Secondly, a definition can be too narrow. In this case, the definition excludes things that should be allowed in. They're kept out. To use an analogy, think about a gatekeeper with a clipboard standing outside of an exclusive club or restaurant or other venue. Now, there's kind of two ways the gatekeeper can fail at their job. One is to let in people who are not on the list. And that'd be like a definition that's too broad. It's letting in things that should not be allowed in. The other way the gatekeeper can fail is by excluding people who are on the list and should be allowed in. And that would be like a definition that's too narrow, that keeps out what should be allowed in. So what would be an example of this from Socrates? Well, there is a good one in the Meno, which is a dialogue, one of the Platonic dialogues. Now in the Meno defines virtue as the capacity to govern. And Socrates presents not but one, but two counterexamples. One to show it's too narrow, one to show that it's too broad. So his first counterexample is this. He says that a child could be virtuous, but lacks the capacity to govern. So this makes the definition too narrow, because defining virtue as a capacity to govern would include virtuous children. His second counterexample is that a tyrant can also govern, but pretty much by definition, a tyrant would not be virtuous. So the definition is too broad. It lets in too much. So that definition of virtue is both too narrow and too broad. Now, in terms of creating a really good definition, you would try to make it so that it's perfect in terms of what it allows in and what it keeps out, neither too narrow nor too broad. Now, in addition to his Socratic method, Socrates was also very much into reasoning and definitions. So, according to our good dead friend Aristotle, about our good dead friend Socrates, two more of the contribution of Socrates included a type of inductive argument and universal definitions. So what sort of inductive reasoning did Socrates contribute? Well, according to Aristotle, Socrates would reason from some specific examples to a general conclusion about the entire class. This is what we now would call an inductive generalization. Now, in fields outside of philosophy, people sometimes define induction as reasoning from the specific to the general, probably because of Socrates here. But in philosophy, we define induction in terms of the argument type. And the way that it's defined is, as you recall back to the argument basics, is an argument such that the premises give us, at best, probability. The premises, if true, make the conclusion probably true. In the case of deduction, they don't go from the general to the specific always, they can do the reverse, but a deductive argument promises us, although it may be a lie, certainty that true premises guarantee a true conclusion. So how did Socrates reason about stuff, and how does this connect to universal terms? Well, according to Socrates, if we apply a universal term like cat to a number of particulars, like various cats, there are two possibilities. Possibility one, the term has a different meaning in each different application. Possibility two, or it applies the same in each case. So what if there is not a common basis for the application of this language? Well, if it wasn't this common application, according to Socrates, language would fall apart. And so he believes that a term, used properly, would refer to a property shared by all the cases to which it applies. So roughly put, all cats would have a common property of catness, not like in the Hunger Games, but there would be this quality of catness. And this gets developed later by Plato to the theory of universals, which we'll see in the future. Now, this method of Socrates leads to the development of what could be called universal definitions. So how do these work? Well, a universal definition involves the view that you can take particulars, individuals, and you can group them into natural categories. So individual cats like Garfield, Fritz, and so forth can be grouped into the category cat. Human beings, like Matt Damon, Beyonce, Dr. Fauci, can all be grouped into the, category of human beings. So these universal concepts allow us to recognize and evaluate particulars, because much like our later dead friend Aristotle, who no doubt got it from Socrates, the idea is you can assess things based on their purpose set by their concepts. So you can judge, for example, a cat in how well it cats. And we still kind of take this view today. We'll say things like, now that's a cat, true cat, or that's a true, person. Now, initially, Socrates doesn't seem to have a metaphysical foundation for his concepts, but they eventually become, as I mentioned earlier, and as we'll see in the future, they become the famous or infamous Platonic forms. Now, Socrates, in the Socratic metaphor or analogy, claimed that he was the midwife to ideas. He takes this to mean that he himself lacks answers and wisdom. Again, he claims that what he knows is he knows nothing, but he can help other people find them in themselves. And this sort of sets the stage for a long-running, still running today, battle in philosophy between two main philosophical camps. We'll see more of this in the future, but they are the rationalists, who believe that you can know some things by reason about the world, by reason without experiencing the world. And they also believe in what are called innate ideas, things that are built in. More of this later on. The contrary group, the opposing group, are the empiricists, and they claim that the mind initially is a blank slate. So anything you know about the world has to come from the outside through the senses. So no innate ideas. Socrates claimed that the truth was not found through the senses, but is written in the soul. And this gives us probably the earliest account of innate ideas. Again, things that are built in, pre-installed in the factory, to use a computer term. So that is the completion of the Socratic method and a bit about inductive reasoning and universal definitions. Next, we'll go on to a bit of metaphysics in Socrates to make sense of some of the things he says in the Apology.